Welcome to the How Do I Become podcast. I'm your host, Chris Gouveia. In this episode, we'll be exploring how do I become a software engineer. Thanks for listening. All right, welcome, Jigish Patel, Senior Software Engineer at Netflix. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit about what you do at Netflix and how long you've been there and what your role is.
Yeah, sure. So I'm what we would call a senior software engineer. What I do is it's interesting to explain. So I don't do anything as it deals with the Netflix product itself. So like streaming video or anything like that. Um, in software development, in order for people who do those kind of things to do their work, you need sort of people to build the infrastructure for them.
Mm-hmm.
So at Netflix, we use Amazon Web Services to host all of our servers and things like that. And so I build a product on top of that that makes it easier for other software developers at Netflix to build, deploy, and manage their software.
Well, tell me about a typical day. Maybe that'll help illustrate that a little bit better.
It might be good to go through like a traditional software company, and then we can circle back to how it relates to my job at Netflix because Netflix works a little differently. So,
Okay.
um, a traditional software company will separate concerns from design, implementation, and even before design, there's the like gathering of requirements. So someone like a PM, a product manager, would sort of gather requirements from the various stakeholders. Now, those stakeholders could be external users,
Mm-hmm.
internal users within the company. It could be business development. It could be marketing folks. It could be sales folks, basically anywhere that you could gather requirements for whatever product it is you're building. These PMs will gather those requirements and formulate sort of kind of a priority ordered list of the things that they would like to see done in the product. And then they would also consult the team that they're working with, the engineering team that they're working with, to figure out if there's any internal initiatives that the engineering team would want to do. Now, think of these as sort of like housekeeping. Like you want to sort of tidy up your house every so often,
Sure.
and the same
Mm-hmm.
works for engineering. Like you write a bunch of code, and after a while some of the old stuff gets kind of crufty and kind of hard to deal with, and or maybe you realize there's a better way of doing things, and so those are also like requirements that would get then fed into the PM. And then the PM would sit down with the actual engineering team that will do both the design and the implementation, and decide what they would like to get done in whatever time period they like to plan for. So sometimes that's quarters, sometimes that's like a couple weeks at a time,
Okay.
maybe a month, maybe a year. It depends on the company. And so they'll get that list out, and then the engineering team will go design whatever they need to design, and then build, as in code up whatever they need to code up. That's how it works generally in like a typical software company. A typical day for me is pretty simple actually. So we'll have a list of tasks that we need to get done in order for our product to progress. We have various requirements that we gather from all of our partner teams, some of our internal users from within the company. We sort of gather all of those on a quarterly basis, and then we'll formulate that into a bunch of tasks that we need to do over the course of that quarter. And so we usually have this like long list of tasks that we need to get finished. And so morning I wake up, see what's next in the queue, and just go at it. That's basically my day. And then it'll be peppered through meetings. Depending on what I'm working on, maybe I'll need to sync with some other teams or sync internally within my team to figure out how we want to approach a particular problem or feature. But yeah, it's mostly just writing code and developing features and fixes and things like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's very helpful to kind of hear how what the software engineers and coders are doing will create the product, but then be maintained and then be moved forward. I think that's a helpful way to view the paradigm, I guess, is so to say.
Yeah, so what I listed was kind of a simplistic view of how things work. I mean, there are many other sort of jobs that feed into this as well. So engineers aren't the only ones working on the product. If your product, for example, has a user interface, which pretty much every single product does,
Sure.
you'll get we call user experience engineers
Mhm.
to build that or to design that, or and different companies work in different ways. Sometimes the user experience engineers design it and the software engineers will build it, or sometimes the user experience engineers will build the product as well. But it's not just software engineers that are doing the work. It feeds into like the entire organization.
And how did you become interested in this field?
I was sort of born into it. Mom worked for Apple for 25 years. Dad worked for Apple as well as many other startups. So I was a I was a computer kid from the very very beginning. Um, I'm sure there's pictures of me 5 years old with like the original Apple
Uh-huh.
computer. Um, so yeah, it's sort of what I wanted to do from a very young age. As I went through school, I had an affinity for and like engineering sort of subjects, so math and science and physics and things like that. And so that sort of reaffirmed my thoughts. I was ready to do engineering from the minute I could think about what I wanted to do.
Mhm. And I think that story is fairly common in the Bay Area, which is where both of us are from. For people who aren't from the Bay Area, is there benefit to doing the coder camps or kind of the young technology things that are out there on the internet for kids and for preteens to try and learn those basic skills?
Absolutely, I think that the earlier sort of you get into the the mindset of engineering, the better it is. It's sort of like doing logic class in like elementary school. It kind of changes the way you approach problem solving, and I think that doing that earlier is better for sure.
And now that you're in a large industry, a large company like Netflix, most of the people that you're working with in the engineering role are most of them formally trained with a bachelor's degree? Because I know there are other routes like Coder Camps and Udacity and other organizations that advertise kind of coder boot camps. Are the people that graduate through those types of programs, are they able to handle the workloads that you guys are seeing?
So I haven't personally worked with anyone who's done a coding bootcamp. Netflix doesn't actually hire generally what we consider to be junior engineers.
Hmm.
Um, we generally only hire senior engineers, which is why in the beginning I said that my software title is senior software engineer. I will say that my brother worked for a coding boot camp, taught, or he actually went through a coding boot camp, then taught for one, and then
Oh,
started
wow.
doing management for one
Mm.
for a while. And he had people coming out of those boot camps and going to like Facebooks and companies like that, Facebook, Google, and those kind of companies. So there are definitely companies that are very willing to hire out of these boot camps because you're sort of guaranteed that in the whatever 8 weeks you're that you're learning in that boot camp, that you're getting a very rigorous education on the immediate uh, like current development practices in software engineering.
Mhm. So I could imagine that if someone is being taught those up-to-date skills, if they can execute, they don't care where they come from. If they're able to do the job right, there's an incentive to have them on board.
Yes, yes. So I think that that is key. In pretty much every software company I've ever been at, execution is key. It doesn't matter what you did before. It doesn't matter at all anything else other than the fact that you execute and do your work
I see. And that maybe that ties into
and do it well.
sure. So the typical path for someone pursuing software engineer, they're finishing high school, they're entering college, always pursuing computer science and engineering, or do people pursue different routes within there?
Um, if you're talking typical, it's always someone in software engineering or software or so. I think that the majors are generally something like computer science or computer science and engineering or electrical engineering and computer science. Those are the
Hmm.
typical uh, things that you see. There are also some people who I guess go the math route. They'll do like an undergrad grad in mathematics, and then um, do like further study in how it applies to computer science. And so you'll see a lot of people like that in data science and stuff like that. Also, interestingly enough, people who have like more circuitous route to computer science sometimes end up in like a sciencey field like astronomy or one of those sciencey fields that are heavy in statistics, and then end up in data science like that way, I guess,
I see.
because they feel like they want to do something more industry related. Um, but yeah, I will say that my brother has seen all sorts of people go through his boot camp, and people of all ages. So um, it's definitely not a requirement to be in engineering from an undergrad, but that is the typical path.
Very cool. So after the 4-year degree, it's pretty typical that people would then go into the job market, but some people do pursue graduate training.
Yes, yes. I think that I have, uh, I guess not strong opinions, but opinions on the matter. Um, I
Give me
went
your
from
opinion.
undergrad. Yeah, yeah. I went from undergrad straight into the job market, and um, I sort of, at the time, I always touted the decision as, oh, I don't like school. I like learning on the job. It's fine, whatever. But after I did it, I realized a couple things. So on the pro side of going directly into industry after college is you learn a lot. You learn a lot in your first, year on the job, and it's the type of learning that you would never be able to do in graduate school.
Sure.
Um, and so that's really good. And also, like, you go to graduate school, you're spending money for 2 years. You go to industry, you're making money for 2 years. So there's also that factor. On the flip side, I will say that um, my peers who have gone to graduate school are sort of more well versed in, like, terminology, I guess I would say, or like um,
A little bit stronger foundational skill.
Yeah, yeah, stronger foundational skill that I have had to learn on the job, and so that's sort of a plus for going to graduate school. I think in the end, it sort of cancels out after your 2 years in um, to your job. You're sort of exactly where you would be if you had gone to graduate school. So I'm not sure it matters aggressively one way or another for the like your total career trajectory. It sort of depends on what you feel like doing. PhD is a different story. So if you're getting a PhD in something very, very specific, then depending on what that something is, you can be in extremely high demand
Right.
coming out of your
Mhm.
PhD. And so that is a whole different ball game. If you're getting your PhD in, for example, machine learning, then I mean you're basically making the big bucks right out of your PhD. So
That's kind of the hot field within software engineering now.
yes, yes, definitely, and it has applications everywhere, which is why it's a hot field.
I think there's a lot of news about, the hot field of software engineering and about people joining startups and companies and making a lot of money, and certainly there are some economic rewards that come with being a software engineer, but tell me about what it's like living that. What's the salary? What's the lifestyle? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it's very, very variable.
Mhm.
If I can talk about if you're living in the Bay, because in other places it's sort of hard to tell because companies definitely take into account cost of living.
Sure.
But if you're living in the Bay, you sort of have two classes of jobs. You have the startup style, where your salary is, I wouldn't. I mean, it's not low, but it's not as high as it could be. But you get a lot of equity, and so
Right.
you're sort of foregoing your salary for the equity in the company, hoping that the company has a big exit and you'll make a ton of money. And then there's the other class of job, which are the more established companies that'll give you a pretty fatty salary, but with a little bit less equity. So if you want to get into numbers, starting salary for a kid out of college, probably in the 120 range, somewhere around there, and then you'll get a decent chunk of equity if you go to a startup. Going up from there, it can get pretty high. I don't think it's. I've definitely heard of engineers at places like Google doing very specific work, making in the millions of dollars, salary wise. Um, and but that requires some very aggressive specialization in some very, like, cutting edge fields. So salary can definitely run the gamut, and so can lifestyle. So
Right.
if you work at a startup, you should at baseline expect to work 10 hours a day at minimum, and probably more. And when you go home, it's not like you're home.
Right.
You definitely will be working at home, and that goes for a lot of companies, not just startups, but it definitely goes for startups as well.
And
And sort of startup. Go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, and you've lived both of those worlds, correct?
Yes, yes. So I've worked at both very small startup, a mid-stage startup, as well as an extremely large company, and then also Netflix. So I've sort of had experience in all of the little slices. Very small startups, definitely a lot of work, and you're definitely going to be there a lot. Our startup, we basically were there from breakfast time through dinner. It was expected that we all eat dinner together, and we would all order together, and then we would stay quite late, maybe 9, 10, go home, sleep, wake up, do it again.
Yeah,
And
living that making it out of the garage lifestyle.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was a very nice garage, I guess, if you want to call it that. But yes, it's definitely sort of, and I think it's sort of the mentality that you have to have when you want to go to a startup, because the idea is that you're trying to work as quickly as you can, because you literally have investors who have put millions of dollars into this idea, and you want to make a product and give them some return on their investment ASAP, lest they back out, or lest, whatever, you run out of runway. So it is definitely a constant time crunch, and that sort of stressor, I guess, is always there. And it requires a certain type of person and a certain type of acceptance with that lifestyle.
Let me transition to a couple individual questions, if you feel comfortable answering.
Sure.
So you mentioned that as companies are growing, a lot of emphasis is taken to continue producing at a high level, and I think Netflix and Amazon are 2 companies that come to mind when I hear that. Can you speak to kind of what the culture is like at Netflix in particular?
Yeah, so Netflix, at least in the software industry, has sort of famously released a culture deck, which is the slide deck that Netflix uses to talk to prospective engineers as well
Mm,
as new
mhm.
hires about how our culture is. Now, that slide deck has changed over the years and isn't in its original format, but the general reasoning behind it hasn't changed. So the idea is that at Netflix, you are sort of like a sports team, not really like a family. In a
Mm,
family, if someone is, not so great or not doing that well, everybody tries to sort of support them and, you know, get them to do better and help them. In a sports team, if someone's not that great, not really doing well, they're fired and they're let go or they're traded off to another team. The
mhm.
idea is that as long as you're producing and as long as you're doing your work and doing it well, then you'll have a great time at Netflix. If you, for some reason, start slipping and getting lazy and complacent, then you're not going to have such a great time at Netflix, and you'll probably be let go very quickly. I think that the way that I've worded that sounds kind of harsh.
Mhm.
In reality, there's a constant feedback loop at Netflix. The idea is that you give feedback early and often. If you're unhappy with something that someone's doing, you'll tell them immediately. And that, as a result of that, if you are underperforming or there is something that your manager or your peers do not like about how you're doing your work, you'll know very quickly, and you'll have a chance to fix it. And Netflix has gone through some sort of ups and downs. I don't know if you remember, but they had that um, yeah, that split between the DVD
Right, right.
organization and the streaming organization, and that was terribly received.
Mm.
And Netflix sort of tanked for a while. It's interesting when you're a new hire. The CEO Reed generally has a sit down with like the new hires, and in my sit down, he told us the story of like what he learned from that split and how that sort of formulated the culture that Netflix has today. So the Netflix culture that I spoke about wasn't the original Netflix culture. In fact, after this split and after Netflix wasn't doing that great, they realized that a small, leaner team was sort of better for the overall organization than the large team that they had before. And so that's sort of what formulated the culture that we have today.
So you've been at Netflix a little bit over 5 years. Is there something you wanna do in the future outside of Netflix, or do you think Netflix might be the career-long option?
So truth be told, I came to Netflix because I thought it was a career long option, and I still think it is. And I think Netflix does a few things that make it better to be a career long option. They're quite comfortable with you moving around internally within Netflix. So I started off with one team that did something very different than what I'm doing today. So that sort of keeps um, the interest alive. I will say that in software engineering, it's not atypical to have someone jump between jobs every couple of
Right.
years,
Mhm.
and there's a couple reasons for that. One, because things stop being interesting after a couple of years or whatever, but also because, especially in the startup industry. Typically, the way that startups work is that your equity vests every year, and you
Mm,
get sort of a 25% chunk every year. And so you stay for 2 years, you get half your equity, and then you go somewhere
I
else,
see.
and it's kind of like placing your bets in the various different startups. So a lot of people end up doing things like that. But you come to Netflix because Netflix offers sort of industry top salary, which is great for a career long option, and very interesting work.
Yeah,
So yeah, I mean, if an opportunity presented itself, my eyes are always open. But Netflix is a great company to work for, and I don't really have a reason to leave.
absolutely. Any other pros and cons that you would mention for people pursuing this field?
Um, yeah, I mean, pro specifically is, I think that depending on obviously the job and the company, you can get a really good sort of work-life balance with software engineering, and software engineering companies
Mm,
are
mhm.
typically extremely good about personal time off and things like that. Netflix has the famous
Mhm.
year-long family leave policy. I mean, nobody actually takes the year, but it's there
Right.
if you need it. And other companies have done similar things in software engineering. So typically, from a work life balance and a benefits perspective, software engineering usually leads the pack. Um, so from that
Mhm.
perspective, definitely a plus. Um, con wise, this may not be a con now after COVID, because a lot of these companies are going 100% remote. But it definitely was a con when I was looking for
Yeah.
jobs. Leaving the Bay Area is almost non-viable. I mean, there are companies outside of the Bay Area, but you take a severe pay cut, and they're not always in the places that you would want to be. So it's sort of Bay Area, Seattle, and a few other places, and that's about it. If you want to work for the big ones. One other con about the software engineer industry, or the software engineer job in general, is um, finding a job. Actually, while there are many jobs available, the interview process is quite annoying. And I think that a lot of these companies use a very typical standard interview process that's been made standard by Google. And I'm not sure I necessarily agree with with its efficacy, but pretty much everybody does it. And the way it works is you generally go in for a day long interview, and you sort of whiteboard these coding and design questions for the entire day. Now that that sounds a couple things. One, it sounds very intense, which it absolutely is, but it also is quite arbitrary because a lot of these questions are structured such that if you sort of get it, you'll get it very quickly. But if you can't think of the little trick to do it, it ends up being quite a problem. So similarly to how, like in college, you would study specifically for the SATs, but that studying really didn't help you anywhere else. It's sort of the same way for software engineering interviews, where you have to study for these interviews, but what you're learning for studying for these interviews doesn't really help you in software engineering at all.
What do you wish you had known when you started pursuing software engineering?
Yeah, I think that when I started pursuing software engineering, I was very focused on the details of the engineering part. I guess like learning various languages and things like that. And I didn't quite understand how important the software part of that is. And
Mm.
I'm using those words as two different things. And what I mean by that is creating software is almost like a little bit of an art. And doing it in a way that's clean and that other people can come in and use is definitely an art form, and I think that that's something that is not as well taught in schools, and it's something that I definitely had no idea about before I entered the workforce. And I mean, I knew how to write code, I knew all these various languages, but I had no idea about how to formulate a product in such a way that it was easy for others to add features to, and extensible and things like that. So the software part of that equation is something that I wish I had known more about.
So if you could go back and talk to yourself as a college sophomore, is there a way that you could have formulated that to tell yourself then that there's a better way to move forward?
Then probably not, but to a college sophomore today, absolutely. So there is a website called GitHub, which is an open source sort of like, I don't know, cornucopia of amazingness. That has like all sorts of open source software, and
Oh,
I
very
would
cool.
suggest to just get active in one of the open source communities, and start building software, and contributing to whatever open source project sounds interesting to you. That is probably the best way to understand the software development process, understand how to write code that's you know clean and easy for other people to use, and sort of hone your skills not just in algorithms and data structures and the raw parts of engineering, but the sort of soft parts of engineering.
So that kind of goes into my next question. What would you tell someone interested in pursuing the path? I guess you just laid out your most important one or one that you feel particularly passionate about, but anything else you would add?
Um, yeah, I think practice makes perfect, and that the GitHub suggestion definitely hits on that. The more you code, the more you write, the better you're going to get at it. So that's definitely um, top of the list.
All right. Well, Jagish, thanks so much for joining us. That's super helpful. I learned a lot.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. That'll do it for today's episode. Thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed the episode, please rate us on Apple and Spotify podcasts and subscribe for more episodes. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at How Do I Become One with the number one.